One of the issues amongst my generation of so-called conscious or awakened individuals is the conflict of dealing with self-gratification, as well as exalting oneself to a status not so necessarily qualified for. Though the process of enlightenment is literally an eye-opening experience, we seem to misconstrue what it means to be awakened versus what it means to discard any form of ego in our spiritual advancements. Many today fashion themselves with a title they have not earned, but feel it worthy to adorn themselves with. References to self such as master teacher, prophet, Christos, and those of the likes are undeserving and even at times given out of ignorance. Ignorance due to the fact that coming to be known by these titles was not in itself indicative of traveling a path of enlightenment, but one that was given after having proved oneself worthy of receiving such a prestige. See, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding is not something you can rush, earn a degree for in a few years, read a few books to obtain, or speak opinions that go unchecked or unchallenged, which thus provides a false sense of ego. Rather, these alchemical processes are those that have to be born, bred, and ripened within man. Just as the grape on the vine, which transmutes from a dew-kissed organism into the putrefied form of wine. Just as nature determines the length of time this putrefaction must take, as untouched by human intervention, it is also within man to await his length of time to putrefy the physical body and ferment his soul. On the other hand, as they state, the older the wine, the better. In the ancient world, the appointing, not self-assumed, of prestige titles and accumulation of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding were based on time cycles rather than quantity of information memorized. For memorization proves less efficient than actualization via experience. They understood this process to take no more or less than 40 years. Yes, 40 years of ongoing study before calling oneself a teacher or even a master. However, why this particular amount of years versus 30, 20, or as today when one considered themselves a master after only a few months? Well, in numerology, which is the branch of knowledge that deals with the occult significance of numbers, 40 represents a compilation of significant changes. This includes a period of turmoil prior to arising into Christhood, a succession of trial and error on the road to enlightenment, as well as a process of completion. For instance, when we look at the Bible, in Acts 1:3, Jesus appeared to his followers for 40 days after being crucified to his following ascension. In Genesis 7:4, the flood of Noah lasted for 40 days. In Numbers 32:13, the Israelites wandered for 40 years in the deserts. The reigns of Solomon and David on Israel lasted 40 years. Buddha made a 40-day fast to the desert before to exert his apostolate. 40 years was the time that Buddha and Muhammad would have begun their preaching. Even in Islam, 40 years or 40 represents the 40 companions, the 40 perfect, the 40 pillars of the universe, the age of 40 when Muhammad first received the revelation, now known as the Quran, and etc. There are a multitude of references throughout the ancient world of 40 being a cycle one must go through prior to their godhood. The Egyptians even likened 40 days to the time that it took the soul to fully dissolve into the universe after the physical body dies and thus being delivered from it. Some even say that it took 40 years to graduate from the esoteric universities of Kemet. Thus, 40 anciently served to be synonymous to a cycle of completion, period of test and or judgment or perfection prior to moving on to another stage. Why this process was assumed to take 40 years, I can't particularly say, but I do know that knowledge, wisdom, and understanding is an alchemical process that takes a considerable amount of time before being finally fermented. See, the lack of oversight and presence of accomplished metaphysicians to teach those coming up has declined since the time of the ancients and has thus alienated, if not destroyed, the teacher-student paradigm. The student has taken over the school of thought, yet not matured in thought themselves. Yes, enlightenment is a process of looking in or to self in order to attain a higher consciousness. But the fact remains that if the student not know where to look initially, how can he or she determine they are even on the correct path? For what feels good is not always particularly spiritually nourishing. The path one is on may feel good, but is it spiritually good? Ego has been allowed to run rampant amongst those calling themselves conscious and not put in check, but by those having gone through their 40 years of enlightenment. Though only a conglomeration of ancient sciences, even secret societies have appointed a hierarchy to supervise and progress the initiate into that of a learned and intricately molded light being. Not hierarchy as you would see in a church where a dictatorship is precedent, but gatekeepers to make sure the knowledge is revealed at the appropriate time. This is not to sway anyone amongst my generation from enlightening themselves, but to rather propose to them to keep the ego in check as much as possible, as even in our spiritual endeavors, it can rear its ugly head and make us glamorize or put ourselves on a pedestal because we think we are more advanced or well learned in a specific topic or area of knowing. Lastly, just as an embryo must undergo gestation to manifest into the new form of a human being, so must man in his spiritual endeavors undergo a period of maturity prior to acquiring or proclaiming himself those set of titles mentioned earlier.